Well, good evening, everybody, one and all, and welcome to Loyola University of Chicago here, as I always say, on the banks of the great Lake Michigan. And I'm not going to do a weather reflection, but I think we're going to get 4 seasons here in 24 hours. So let's all enjoy a vintage Chicago evening. Thank you all for attending, for coming out tonight, and thank you for joining us here at the Hank Center. And before I begin, I want to say a word of thanks to our intrepid staff, Grace Shalal and Connor Quaglino, who are here, Mary Countryman, who's not here, and our center manager, Katie Arnold. Thanks for getting us in order. Really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you again, one and all, for coming out. And so this is our annual St. John Henry Newman Lecture. And the series is named after the great 19th century prelate who wrote very movingly about his intellectual journey towards Roman Catholicism, particularly in his spiritual autobiography, Apologia pro vita sua from 1864. Newman's work helped later generations of Catholics and Catholic converts map out ways to understand the intellectual stakes of religious faith in light of contemporary issues facing modern life. Mapping, Jason, the cartography of St. John Henry Newman. Jason likes to think in maps and stories as well, but as we talked about last night, so that just occurred to me as interesting. Honoring this engagement with the Catholic tradition, the Hank Center invites scholars each spring to recount their own discovery or rediscovery, as often, of the Catholic intellectual heritage in light of their ongoing scholarship, reflection, and experience as a person of faith in the 21st century. So often these scholars, just like Newman, value the fullness of our lives in God. The great gift of being a scholar, which is no small gift, or demand, really, and the invitation to engage the things that matter, like Newman did, in that way where cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. With Jason, I think we're going to hear this in his compelling story of his conversion. This is a nimble and deep intellect, but what moves our heart, right? We know that with our university in St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was often moved to tears at what God was doing in and through him. His heart was changed. Jason is from Pepperdine University, and he's a political philosopher and a leading scholar of contemporary communitarian and post-liberal thought, especially the work of philosophers Alasdair MacIntyre and the great Charles Taylor. The great Alasdair MacIntyre, too, please. I mean, that man gives talks every year, and he's 95 over at Notre Dame, our little sister school to the east. Jason is a writer whose books and essays often straddle deep divides of left and right. That means religious and secular, academic and popular. And he has also contributed to leading public venues like Harper's Magazine and The Atlantic. Jason has also written numerous journal articles that are refereed and occasional pieces too. And he's the author of 4 books now, with his latest, Lost in Ideology, Interpreting Modern Political Thought, which is from Agenda. That's coming out in March. Couldn't recommend it any more. I've read the introduction and the first 2 chapters now, and it's a perfect book for our season, I'll put it that way. He's got a book coming too with his dear friend, David Albertson, and that's also of a piece. It's called Utopian Fragments, A Politics Without Fear. This is in preparation. It's coming from Yale University Press. So tonight, we get to talk about everybody's favorite dinnertime subjects, religion and politics. Jason's lecture will be really on his conversion, but we may seep into some politics afterwards. That's always possible. Jason's lecture is about 45 minutes. And then we'll have some good times for 20 to 25 minutes for conversation. And so glad Jason's family is here too. That's wonderful. And without further ado, let's welcome Jason to our midst.
Thank you to Mike Murphy, and thank you to the Hank Center. I mean, I'm very humbled to be able to speak under such a the namesake of such a towering figure as Newman, who's just a huge figure within the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I'm also just honored and gratified by Mike and the people at the Hank Center for their hospitality. And I think that hospitality is not often thought of as an intellectual virtue, at least I often don't, but I was reflecting on my time yesterday with some people associated with Loyola and Hank and the Hank Center, and there really is a virtue in hospitality in that it lets the other person speak, it listens to other ideas, without which you really wouldn't have a robust intellectual life. And I admire what Mike is doing with the Hank Center. So I was going to tell you guys a story, obviously, and the story is about my conversion in my 20s. I'm now over 40, but in my 20s, from atheist to Catholic, which is, as I was told when I was a graduate student at Berkeley at the time, the wrong direction, and no one has ever gone that direction before. What are you doing? It's like you're going the wrong way on a one-way street there. But I also wanted to just say before I try to tell you this story, and by the way, stories should just be good, and I guess that's on me, the storyteller, to try to make it as good as possible to listen to. But my tradition of thought that I work within is hermeneutics, philosophical hermeneutics, Hans-Georg Gadamer and Charles Taylor and those people. And so I always think stories are argumentative as well. And I think that modern people, and particularly certain streams of life in the universities, if you say a story is argumentative, people think, well, there's nothing really argumentative about a story, right? I mean, it's just a tale, children do those. And there's a favor instead for abstract formalism. But I think stories are always argumentative because they always make some bid on what's significant, right? And what's significant in human life in this case. And so I want you to listen for the argumentative features. I also try to draw some conceptual distinctions. And for those of you who are really into philosophy, I do think of this as a phenomenology. I'm trying to hybridize Gadamer and Augustine together. But it really is just a story I'm going to tell you. So, and if I can say one other thing, I think stories are way more transformative than abstract argumentation, though a lot of my analytic philosophy friends would disagree. But, I think of the difference, saying at a Catholic university, think of the difference between the story and the four Gospels, the story, and a proof for the existence of God, And it is just infinitely more transformative to read those four stories than a proof for the existence of God. I almost want to say polemical things, like if you only convert, as some people do in the modern age, because you want to prove the existence of God through a syllogism, you may not have converted at all because you might be worshiping a concept or an argument and not actually the living God that extends beyond all human understanding. So I will say polemically that stories are far more transformative. And by the way, the proof can be helpful. I'm not against the proof. It's just that to me, the story is really the heart of the matter. So, yes, turn off the screen. Thank you. I don't think I can compete with the screen, yeah. I never have, yeah.
Sorry.
There it goes. No worries, thanks. Oh, no worries, yeah. All right, so now the storytelling bit, but listen for the argument, please. Story is titled Atheist, A Story of Conversion. Part 1, Graduation. I graduated from high school in Colorado in 1999, the final year of the millennium and nearly 2,000 years after the birth of Christ. In April of that same year, just an hour down the road, two students by the name of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold precipitated the era of nihilistic, obliterative massacres in America by murdering 12 of their classmates and one teacher before blasting bullets into their own brains. The killings largely happened inside the library, a room that in American high schools, at least before the rise of computers, seemed the closest to a contemplative, even enchanted space, with rules about silence, geometric rows of shelves, and hidden corners. But now, there was blood splattered on the books. The lives of the innocent victims were like mute pages that would never be opened again, with signs and letters inscribed in their flesh. You have to remember that this was before mass shootings had been put on seemingly endless loop. The entire country had not yet learned the unspoken, dark habit of being unsurprised. Those of us who were set to graduate that year discovered that some in our generation believed it was better to destroy than to create, to nullify than to affirm. Rather than a journey towards graduation together, these two boy men had chosen death, nulla cum laude. Dostoevsky had prophetically warned in Demons, a book, I wonder if it was on the shelf in the library that day, that the deadliest poison in human life is not anger, but boredom. A boredom that contains the most thorough rejection of existence. A mocking, lazy, listless, proud, ugly, and spiteful boredom that looks at the whole of being, its shimmering grandeur, its never-spent newness, and says one single word, no. Part 2, Columbine. The high school where the massacre happened was named for Colorado's official wildflower, the columbine. In the Rocky Mountains, columbines grow in alpine meadows and tundra. Their blooms gather in clusters in harsh terrain, with open sepals and petal blades looking almost like faces, white and blue, gazing back at winded hikers. The fragile appearance of the columbine can be ghost-like amid the jagged rocks and cold scree, the remote peaks and dark ravines, a luminous and strange apparition of the gift of being. I remember traveling to Columbine at least one time before the shooting with the junior varsity soccer team to play a scrimmage. What struck me about their high school building was that it resembled our own. Every school built at that time, everyone's now familiar with this sociological cliche, was an architectural echo of a factory, an office park, or a prison. Elements repeated, like the copy and paste function on an algorithm. Hard lines, panoptic arrangements, naked glass, and unadorned bricks and concrete. A bad infinity, without redemption. A combination of the hard boundedness of matter and the empty eternity of mathematical form. Similarly, my own hometown was sprawling to the south, away from its historical core, and into an ever-repeating suburb. Tracks of anywhere and anyone housing, alternating the same chain stores with the same slick advertising. Little boxes, as Pete Seeger had sung. Little boxes made of ticky-tacky. Abolishing any particularity of place, all social reality like numerical units on a time series graph, or the repeating background on a video game. Blotting out the mountains, the columbines, the planets, the wind over the plains, and the stars. As much as we despised Klebold and Harris for what they had done, some of us silently wondered, was a different form of the same unholy poison inside of us, running through our veins? Had we been born into what Bob Dylan referred to as the sin of lifelessness? Sometimes everything seemed to repeat itself before our eyes in a dead way, phantasmagoric. There was something suffocating to sensitive youth in that. Many experienced it as an overwhelming desire to escape or move elsewhere. As Arcade Fire later summarized the feeling in a song titled The Suburbs, much later, in the suburbs I learned to drive, and you told me we'd never survive. Grab your mother's keys, we're leaving. Part 3, an aside on nihilism. As painful as it is to pose the question, almost obscene, why do more people not succumb to the grotesquely violent, suicidal nihilism of Harris and Klebold? I recognize it's an obscene question, right? I mean, I can see the psychologists like cringing. Why, do we not succumb to this nihilism of Harris and Klebold? Why do so many people, despite their very real sufferings, never even come close? An initial answer, offered all too briefly, is that a receptivity and even wonder for existence saves us. We are all born into infinitely various circumstances, but meaning is always waiting for us. We accept some of life's goods as simply given. These offer us something to become fascinated with, an activity, a game, a person, a tradition, a piece of reality. We also perceive that many of those around us who care for us have helped sustain and communicate those goods, and are often included among them. We therefore grant to others some modicum of our sympathies and even our full-blown affections. We sense ourselves in a tentative friendship with those who share our life. So much is this the case that the true or absolute nihilist nearly does not exist. The human problem is instead one of too much meaning, in tumultuous and bewildering form. Humans are born, you could even say, in the grips of meaning, and the more they try to escape it, the more they tangle themselves in its gossamer threads. Already as a teenager, like most people, I accepted the gift of being. But I didn't know it. I wouldn't have called it the gift of being. I wouldn't even know what someone meant by that. I accepted it in friendships, poetry, books, sports, nature, art, family. I liked soccer. I liked drawing. I liked music. Just like a normal, kid, like a lot of kids. Like many young people, I was hopeful and filled with big expectations, even if melancholy and doubt were already gnawing at the edges. But most of all, I'd already met Elle. Have I not mentioned Elle yet? I met her the fall of my senior year of high school. She edited the stories I submitted to the student newspaper. She was bright and sensitive, and to my eyes, absolutely entrancing. We started to talk and later go on dates to cafes and diners. She was also there from before graduation and before the news of the mass killing. She was beautifully there, a gift on the rocky trails of life, a Columbine flower. Part 4, 2 atheisms. My earliest atheism was not one of conviction. That would come later. It was one of habit, a pattern of life, a disenchanted way of being in the world and perceiving reality. Was I taught that atheism before I knew what it meant? Through social practices, rituals, and ways of dwelling? Or did I actively choose it, guided by instinct and intuition? What is certain is that my earliest atheism was not very theoretical. It was felt, the feeling of an absence. Atheist was not an idea at all, but a lived reality, a modus vivendi. Were many more of us atheists than we realized? Not all of us, of course. But was there a pattern of life that lacked awareness of the gift of being? Were many of us now governing our lives by the laws of boredom, dryness, disconnection, violence, the state, the nation, and the shopping mall? Well, my father, who could be a fierce critic of organized religion, and particularly Christianity and the Catholic Church, was also definitely no atheist. He taught me to see in nature a deep spiritual dimension while hiking in the mountains, probably owed to him even that description of Columbine flowers. And also to admire the artistic searching of the counterculture. That was his generation. He associated with the counterculture. As for my mother, she was a practicing Catholic from Colombia, Latin American, but mostly silent about her own faith. From before I could remember, I inherited my father's skepticism toward the churches. If anything, I was far more skeptical of nearly all spiritualisms than he was. The counterculture was very open spiritually, right? Whereas I thought that was also bogus. I thought that everything from Christian evangelicals to hippie New Agers was bogus. The skepticism of all things was easier to believe in that time. This is like late 80s, early 90s. Because of something we all talked about a lot called the end of history, which was in all the newspapers, and political experts droned on about incessantly in my teen years about the end of history. What was the end of history? Well, one way, I try to explain to my students what the 90s were like, or what the 80s were even like, or pieces of the Berlin Wall drifting in, and we'd all go by them and all this stuff. But one thing I can say is that it was kind of the end of moral heroisms. And irony seemed like the only really authentic stance, which of course is oxymoronic, that to be ironic is somehow like authentically feeling yourself, right? But that distant kind of sarcasm, right? Indeed, the end of history for many of us simply meant there were no new prophets or future revolutions that would be forthcoming. Some people were happy about that. Some people were sad. Some people were indifferent, but everyone just felt like nothing is coming down the road of the future our way. All that could be said had been said. All that could be done had been done. And while many groups claimed to believe in God or hold some special spiritual or moral insight, it in fact made little difference in practice as far as I could see. Here at the end of history, everyone was the same. Sameness was the spiritual and moral order of the day. This was also true of the Christians I knew, or at least I thought it was. If anything, many of the Christians around me were less alive to human loss and suffering than my father, who identified with the counterculture, or my mother, for that matter, who didn't talk about faith very much at all. Less responsive to injustice, more acclimated to evil and the deadening boredom. Their faith and my disbelief seemed to make not a jot of difference, although I might have reflected, I should say, longer on what my mother offered me as a mother and what Father Greg Boyle later called the no-matter-whatness of love. At the time, however, it seemed clear that at least unbelief had one big advantage over belief, which is it looked at reality without any wild metaphysical conjectures or unnecessary add-ons. This initial felt atheism was not very militant. It was even somewhat apathetic. But it would later turn into a second kind of atheism that was far more intensely held and philosophically sophisticated, an atheism of conviction. Part 5, Holiness of the Flesh. Beginning in 1998, when we met and started our long, sprawling conversations, Elle and I, she was 17, I was about 17 as well. I think I was slightly older than her, so I might have turned 18 somewhere in there. Wanted out of this deadening feeling, you know? It was like a Bruce Springsteen song. You got to get out of town, right? But we associated chiefly and unfairly with our hometown. No offense, Bruce, but, you know. One early method of escape was each other, a quickening of the heart, a newness of life. There's no emotional landscape quite like that of young people infatuated or in love. You can look at each other's faces for hours. As for kissing, it is for a short time more intoxicating than the entire catalog of narcotics that can pass through human lips. Later, not so much, turns out, but. After what seemed to me like very long months of ritual kissing, I lost all bona fide claims to chastity on Easter Vigil. I had been catechized enough to be haunted by the liturgical calendar. Elle didn't know. She grew up in a culturally Protestant family that had long ago disgorged itself of all religion, with the notable exception of an almost awe-inspiring devotion to work. This was said to be the foundation of her family's relative wealth and their status at places like our local country club. It must have been around 2 years earlier that I had attended my final Mass. From early childhood, my mother insisted we go to Sunday Mass and receive the sacraments, but the sacrament of confirmation was the last time that I went to weekly Mass for over a decade. The irony of this, like my new profane sacrament of the erotic, was not lost on me at the time. My adult confirmation of faith was in actuality my public ceremony of departure. I had my own Holy Mass now, and my own Holy Communion, and it seemed far more bodily than any priest passing out paper-thin wafers. Besides, graduation meant I was leaving from Colorado, from my mother's Mass-going, from the infinite, repeating, morbid liturgy of the suburbs. I was leaving for New York. Elle was leaving for Kansas and later Boston. We were staying together. We would write letters. I wrote poems. We would do everything to visit each other. This was a bodily communion I believed in, a creed I could confirm. Credo in unum sanctum. If I had been asked at age 18, what do you have faith in? I would have not hesitated to answer. And it wasn't such a bad answer after all. I have faith in Elle. Part 6, Atheist as Hero. As an undergraduate, studying politics and philosophy at Vassar College in the Hudson Valley, I became convinced that the only rational view of existence was that it was absurd. I read Camus, Sartre, Kafka, Kierkegaard, and many others. But most of all, I read Nietzsche and Heidegger. I remember many slow hours in Vassar's beautiful neo-Gothic library, bent over being and time, to learn that death is, quote, always my own. That I was always already what Heidegger called thrown in the world, coping, struggling, navigating, getting lost. Nothing could spare us, Heidegger taught, from this existential precarity, this being in the world. But the authenticity of real thinking could make us aware of what we already were. This is also when the void became palpable, even terrifyingly real to me. It became realer to me, the void, than any existing thing. Existing things were hardly here. After all, they were only skating for a while on the surface of the void before they vanished. An emptiness was opening up before my field of perception. It was so vast and awe-inspiring that it perhaps even heralded, without my knowing it at the time, a mystery no mind can comprehend. If an atheist can feel the fear of God and not know it, I think this experience might have been it. Augustine wrote that if we understand, that still isn't God. I did not understand the void, the big empty, but it was carving out a negative space, like putting the walls around a tabernacle that's still not filled or occupied. Before the walls go up, it's just swirling atmosphere. It's negative. Then sides are forged, and the wheat is harvested, and the bread without leaven is baked, and the priest says the words. Suddenly, there's a dwelling place made in the emptiness. But at this time, for me, only the emptiness was real. I encountered the big nothing. I thought I understood what Milan Kundera meant by the unbearable lightness of being. A little ripple in the waters of existence, and none of us were even here. The professor who had the greatest influence on me at this time taught a class in phenomenology and existentialism. She was a native of Milan with stylish glasses. She wore all black and commuted from Manhattan by train. She was a remarkably gifted teacher, and in my memory, I still have affection for her. She taught me that philosophy must start from existence, from the actual embodied reality of life, not from the abstractions that preoccupied so much of philosophy in the modern world and in universities. Academic philosophers, for instance, lock themselves inside the nutshell of all sorts of pseudo-problems, like Zeno's paradox or Descartes' ego. But existential philosophy, she taught me, went back to being, which always precedes knowing. Being is always before you know anything. She taught me that true philosophy starts from existence and not arcane and invented epistemological problems. This sensibility she passed on to me has never left me. Indeed, viewed from a certain perspective, my conversion has not really traversed such a large swath as first appears, but only the distance from the existentialism of Nietzsche to the existentialism of Dostoevsky. Death, my Milanese Vassar professor would paraphrase Heidegger, always comes from behind. I can still hear her saying it with her Italian accent. Death always comes from behind. Like you think you control, you think you plan. Or sometimes she would say that thinking only started when something in the flow of existence broke down or became what she referred to as not ready at hand, or she would say unhinged, it's not working. That's when you start thinking. Philosophers are people who've been interrupted in the flow of being, maybe even interrupted more than most people in the flow of being. But most of the time, humans, philosophers are not thinking in a philosophical sense at all. We're just going about our lives, navigating being in the world. We're doing it right now. She also offered a kind of solidarity before the absurd. She could quote Nietzsche's aphorisms the way some Christians can quote scripture. And I have to say, retrospectively, I basically imitated her. I could quote Nietzsche. I could quote Heidegger the way some people quote scripture. One time she told me that most of humanity was psychologically or even spiritually hemophiliac, which is actually out of Nietzsche, I later realized. A single cut, and they bleed to death. So, most humans buffer themselves from existence, turn away from the big nothing. But atheists, she told me, were different. Atheists had intellectual courage and spiritual strength. They could survive more truth than others could. La Rochefoucauld had said Neither death nor the sun can be looked at for very long. I love that aphorism. Neither death nor the sun can be looked at for very long. This is true, but the atheist could look at the black hole sun the longest. Atheist in this way became a badge of honor to me. It was the name for a new kind of heroism, the name of a journey, the title of the person who traveled the farthest to the outermost limits of the universe, history, time, and being, had peered over the edge of the precipice, so large and vast that all the stars and planets could easily disappear inside of it and flicker out like candles. This traveler, this final adventurer who had discovered a boundless abyss, still had the courage to return and report to others what he or she had seen. The nothing so pure, it can't be thought, because if you think it, you've already rendered it a thing. If you understand, it still isn't nothing. Those who have never been atheists, those of you here who have never been atheists, you have to know everything in life can come to signify the death of God. I see it now with the eyes of faith. Everything sings God's name. With the eyes of faith, everything is a sign. But you can live in the world and everything points to the void. Everything points to the big nothing. Everything you encounter, everything you know, science, politics, technology, psychology, your family, nature, your own conscience, the failure of your relationships, etc. Everything can witness to the void and pay homage to it. As Nietzsche declared, quote, unconditional, honest atheism is the only air we breathe, we more spiritual men of this age. At this time, L also transferred to Boston College. We only noticed much later how the Jesuits there, who taught some of her classes, had begun to influence her. So there was already Jesuit infiltration going on. And look where I am tonight. They've got me. They've totally got me now, right? They were having her read not only Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, I was reading Nietzsche, but also T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and John's Gospel. Once a semester, with a borrowed car, she'd visited Vassar, and we never gave up on each other or our relationship. So I thought myself alone this whole time, but I was already in relationship with someone and with something that I didn't fathom. Part 7, New York City. After graduating from Vassar, I followed L north to Boston. Then sometime later, we moved to New York. We rented a studio apartment in the West Village on Charles Street. It was so small that you could reach the stove and fry an egg while still sitting at the foot of the bed. And that's not hyperbole. Like, that is actually, those were the dimensions of the studio apartment. The second largest room in the apartment was the closet, which in turn was bigger than the bathroom. You couldn't have a single guest over for a bite to eat unless you made the bed, because there's a good chance they'd either have to sit on it or like sit right next to it. And it's very uncomfortable, actually, to eat dinner next to someone's unmade bed, it turns out. So you learn very quickly that you have to make the bed. Nonetheless, we loved our small little place because even living inside such a modest space, it felt like the whole of Manhattan was ours. At that time, I thought of New York City not only as the hub of American culture, but as the capital of the times. This is very early aughts, the metropolis of the epoch. Living in the city, everyone referred to it this way grammatically with a definite article, as if there were really only one in the entire universe, excited my pride. After growing up in a small town in Colorado, simply surviving in the city seemed a grand accomplishment. I bought fashionable clothes and imitated the hipsters in Williamsburg. I grew out my beard. At that time, now all kinds of people grow out their beard, but at that time, only the hipsters were growing out their beard. And it was right after September 11th, so the only people Americans knew who grew out their beard were Islamists. And here are the hipsters growing out their beards. I was like, that looks cool. I'm going to grow out my beard. Also, looks like it takes less work. I think I'll try that. I tried smoking cigarettes, which miraculously I was somehow very bad at and sputtered out before it became a habit. I should say as an aside that if, smoking has gratefully gone into decline as a mass cultural practice, but obviously it was huge a few decades ago. But, there's like an art how to light a cigarette in New York City in your jacket while you're walking while the wind, but I never did that. So I never could. I tried. And so almost burned myself, light the jacket on fire. I also had decided I'd become a novelist or a poet. That was an idea I had from very early on. I wanted to be a novelist or a poet, for who more than artists created their own meanings ex nihilo. as a rebellion against the void. That is really how I thought of the vocation of the artist. But I did not choose heroes as my heroes Dante or Eliot, who saw themselves as participating in the mysterious unfolding of meanings in the life of God. No, I took as my paragons Camus and Kafka, or perhaps in a strange way, ancient Greek tragedians. As Nietzsche prophetically envisioned, art would be my affirmation of tragic finitude, of the precarity of human life. Dante was wrong. There was no divine comedy, only a human, all too human tragedy. Art was the great amen of the creative will to the emptiness of a world without God. We made our own meanings, we would make our own gods. Part 8, A Hell of Time. I carried out this project for several years. In New York, I worked at a branch of the Strand bookstore near Wall Street that later closed, called the Annex. When I arrived, some of the staff claimed that dust from the 9/11 towers falling still remained on the high shelves in hard-to-reach places. I mostly checked in new stock and shelved books in narrow aisles. At night, I wrote short stories, poems, and novels. I didn't sleep very much during this time, only a few hours a night. After writing until well after midnight, I would read more books than I could remember until my mind and body gave out in the early hours of the morning. Joyce, Nabokov, Italo Calvino, Merleau-Ponty, William Shire's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Borges' short stories, Foucault's genealogies, Hegel, Proust, Anne Carson's autobiography of Red, Emily Dickinson, Howard Zinn's People's History, and Paul Johnson's Modern Times, Michelle Welbeck's Elementary Particles, Julio Cortázar, the Beat Poets, Tom Wolfe, Joan Didion, Saul Bellow, Edward Said, Shakespeare, Elizabeth Bishop. I read many strange books, too, with no lasting value, curios and ephemera, books I will never remember again. In the background, the mercurial lyrics of Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde were often playing. Little Boy Lost. He takes himself so seriously. He brags of his misery. He likes to live dangerously. I would be up again early in the morning to take the subway for the opening shift at the bookstore. Elle was still with me. She was always there, and by comparison, far more sensible and balanced. She had a job waiting tables at a high-end restaurant on Bleecker Street. She went to sleep when her work shift was over, ignoring the lamp on by the sitting chair where I was perched until the most crazed hours of the night. Inside that little haloed beam of electric light, my mind was darkening. I was driving myself to exhaustion. There was some kind of unsound glory and sad agitation usurping my mind. That's also around the time that my body began to falter. I began to experience a swarm of symptoms: headaches, dizzy spells, numbing and buzzing in my arms and legs, extreme exhaustion. I kept a meticulous journal of all my symptoms. I'd always been healthy, even somewhat athletic, though my fascination with philosophy had gradually made me more sedentary and bookish. By all appearances, I was a healthy young man, and yet my head wouldn't stop spinning. Finally, one night in October of 2005, at the age of 25, I found myself asking Elle if she would please walk with me to check me into the emergency room a few blocks away at the old St. Vincent's Hospital off 7th Avenue. My heart was palpitating and I felt dizzy. I was certain I was dying. I remember staring at the dirty fluorescent ceiling in the ER while Elle held my hand with a look of pity on her face. Whenever one of the nurses or doctors who were ignoring me passed by, she squeezed my hand and looked up earnestly, hoping they might at least pause to ask my name and ask why I was there. This went on for the entire night, and I was finally discharged in the morning and directed to see a number of specialists. By the way, retrospectively, it makes perfect sense why I was ignored. They were triaging people who were actually like visibly sick, you know? The summer before all this went down, there had been a new employee at the bookstore. She was blonde and had large blue eyes she would outline with heavy black eyeliner. She wore tight shirts and old blue jeans and spoke in a low-pitched voice. I also remember she wanted to be a novelist like me, and her last name was the same as a famous English romantic poet. One time I was shelving books in this narrow aisle, and she seemed to purposely brush up close against my back, though I probably imagined it. When I turned around, she smiled over her shoulder but kept walking away. A few weeks later, she was gone. She had taken an internship at a magazine somewhere, the kind of literary internship all of us at the bookstore desperately wanted. After she left, I felt depressed and confused about the world. For reasons I could not explain, I felt like I was failing, but I did not even know what I was failing at. If life was about resoluteness before the void, the big nothing, then what kept anything from slipping into it? 2 quick deletes on the keyboard, the flick of a finger, and all that was solid would melt into air. A few weeks later, the dizzy spells started again. My body was numb. It almost seemed to me as though I was losing the will to live. Part 9, the thread. This is what my philosophy had brought me. I had no sense of what a good life was other than the struggle of my will against the void. And death, although I contemplated it constantly, was almost unthinkable. As conceited and silly as it sounds, if the sole meanings of the universe were whatever I projected outwards, then if I died, everything that was meaningful died with me. Was this terrifying emptiness so vast also preparing a space? Even then, was the good gardener's hand digging in the soil, seemingly emptying me out to later place a seed? Over the course of several long months, I began to realize I was not sick in the medical sense at all. I was experiencing a collapse of meaning, not just spiritually, but in my body. Elle was with me the entire time, and I gradually began to return to health. I missed several weeks of work, and one night, lying deflated in my sickbed in the West Village, I asked if she'd marry me. It surprised her, because before that, I'd always maintained that marriage was an inauthentic convention of the bourgeois class. It was like Pete Seeger's Little Boxes, only imposed on human eros. Marriage was the realm of anyone's and anybody's. It was anonymous and conventional. But suffering in the way that I had, and Elle's witness had finally begun to teach me something different. Was there anything more beautiful than to promise someone to accompany them to the vanishing point on the horizon of existence, no matter what? Although we were not yet married, was not this accompaniment what Elle was already doing for me? My heart was shattered, but a new heart was still beating in the cracked shell of the old one. I wanted to say a full, happy, and eternal yes to the love she was already showing me. I wasn't able to say anything near like this at the time. To the contrary, my proposal was muttered and half-stammered, and I think I was probably in my pajamas, to be honest with you. Would you marry me? Or maybe, I think we could maybe get married. But believe it or not, it brought tears to Pretty Elle's eyes because it was spoken in truth. And she asked me, "Do you mean it?" "Yes, I meant it," I repeated. "I meant it, yes." Here was a love I did not deserve. It almost defied belief that she would still feel so moved to marry me. After all my selfishness and sickness, my arrogance and pride, I'd been wretched and useless for a month, and yet my sickbed proposal could bring tears of happiness to her eyes. Slowly, I realized that even though I thought of myself as having lived a heroic life in the face of a meaningless universe, in which the only meaning came from me, I'd in fact been surviving on a meaning that came from outside myself. I'd been surviving on someone else's love, on a relationship with someone else. It doesn't have to be romantic, doesn't have to be eros, but another was sustaining me. Indeed, though I could not have seen it or articulated yet, I began to perceive there was a way in which we were all sustained and would not even last a single minute longer without love, or at least the hope of love, even if we find ourselves in a loveless place. I'd always lived off love, a dog eating scraps from the master's tables, but I had not fully put myself in love's service. Following Elle, I began taking small steps out of the dark corner. We married in the next summer and moved to Chicago, where Elle attended graduate school in journalism, and I worked for a half year at Powell's bookstore, but the outlet basement in the Loop, which I think they closed, I checked it out when I was here. It was a wholesale basement. It got almost no street traffic, but it was lovely working there. But by the next year, it was off to Berkeley for me to study political philosophy and to begin a new life. Part 10, the strangeness of the self. At Berkeley, I went deep into the study of politics and the human sciences. My intellectual convictions had been long-standing when it came to the social sciences. I was dissatisfied. Nowhere did I see the psychologist or social theorist who understood human life with the same interpretive depth, clarity, and nuance as the great novelists and literary minds. It seemed to me that the narrative and literary artists were worlds ahead of the psychologists and social scientists, or at least so I thought. The social scientists kept building self-refuting theories, a long chain of sciences of human behavior. All of these assumed a mechanistic or impersonally causal science of human life was at hand. But a self is not reducible to a bundle of mechanisms. It's a living set of meanings. We're storytelling animals, already living inside our stories, and not stories that we command autonomously, but that we already find ourselves within midpoint in our families, cities, societies, and worlds. Our bodies signal out stories and flesh stories. I want to stress that this is a point about materiality. Elk have antlers, squid have tentacles, and humans have fleshly, bodily stories that they in turn interpret and feed back into their flesh in a loop that re-encodes and metamorphosizes them and their social worlds. The way when you see a beautiful octopus change a bunch of colors, we're doing that all the time, but with meanings. The clothes we wear, the way we sit, the way we talk, we're signaling, we're embodying meaning. The human animal can modify creatively its stories by reinterpreting action, akin to songbirds molting feathers. Our very selves are meaning incarnate. Strip away the meaning, and you have no self left, only a lump of unworkable biological tissues. History itself is disclosed as a narrative through the interpretive dynamic. Our societies also change their meanings and physical configurations, like those tree frogs that dramatically mutate color. I still believe that one of the best reasons to be an atheist would be if we could give an account of reality that eliminated meanings and revealed nothing but impersonal mechanisms. If the universe could be explained in terms of a naturalistic, immanent determinism, then atheism would be far more credible philosophically than theism. But here's the rub. No one has actually accomplished the naturalist project. No one has come even close. It's just a wild aspiration. You might even say it's an article of faith that disavows itself as a faith. Instead, the actual human situation up to the present day is that meanings and stories are ineliminable from the world. Being doesn't seem to permit the subtraction or elimination of stories and meanings. This is one way to understand how the self became strange to me again. No one was more definitive to me intellectually in this regard than the Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor. Before I read Taylor, I believed that no intellectually honest Christian faith was possible. Among my favorite quotes, since I was, I guess, still imitating this beloved professor I had at Vassar, and I could quote Nietzsche, I still can quote Nietzsche because of that, was Nietzsche's barb that thou shalt not lie killed God. See, I don't have to read that one off. Thou shalt not lie killed God. Think about that one for a while. Intellectual honesty, not telling lies, is what led to the death of God in Europe. But reading Taylor's philosophy, and particularly his book, A Secular Age, which had been published around this time, exploded forever my foolish prejudice that theists could not be intellectually honest. Now the whole human world and cosmos became enchanted to me again. We can't get rid of meanings. We are blessed and doomed to live in meaning's webs. Indeed, humans without meaning are an impossibility. They wither and die. The only ultimately serious question is not suicide, as Camus thought, but instead, which story makes the most sense out of our lives? The question is not, why is the universe meaningless? That's the wrong question. But why is the world so tantalizingly and perplexingly overflowing with meaning? Second to last part, they're both shorter now. Part 11, biography versus nowhere. Biography versus nowhere. I ceased being an atheist when I came up against major philosophical problems, not only in myself and my own lived story, what you might call biography, but also in what it means to be a self, or what you might call anthropology. You might almost say this is the crux of the matter. biography, and anthropology. At least since Augustine's Confessions, biography has been among the most powerful forms of theology. I'm not a theologian, so I probably shouldn't say this, but it might even be that biography is the most powerful form of theology, since both the Old and New Testament can be read as a grand biography of God. As it says in Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, and void and darkness was on the face of the deep. We meaning makers have a secret door into the cosmos. We are the closest and the furthest to being, because we can self-consciously reflect upon it from the inside out. If you go deep inside, you're in an inner space, a galaxy in some ways vaster and more perplexing than the constellation of stars. But we neglect this inner route, or at least I neglected this inner route, this way to enchantment through the ineliminable depths of the self. Why? Because at least I imagined myself, and I think a lot of people do, in the outsider position of the cosmos, as if we were in the impersonal position of the planets and the stars. Or perhaps better, we imagine ourselves as watchers with no location at all, an infinitesimally small, almost vanishing point with no extension in space and no duration in time. This is my gloss on what sometimes philosophers call the view from nowhere. And it leads to a trap that Nietzsche foresaw, which he summarizes in the third essay of the Genealogy of Morals as, since Copernicus, man seems to have gotten himself on an inclined plane. Now he is slipping faster and faster away from the center. Into what? Into nothingness. Once we adopt the view from nowhere, human life takes on the illusion of meaninglessness. Lives, works, civilizations, they look like mere motes of dust. But we do this too by a trick of meaning. We go inward into our imagination to picture ourselves where we can never be. It is actually by the inside route and through a repressed story or meanings that we bewitch ourselves into thinking the universe has no meanings at all. The position of meaninglessness is itself an imagined grid of meanings. Part 12, last part, St. Mary Magdalene, Berkeley. While we lived in Berkeley, Elle began working as a journalist in San Francisco. She would take the train under the bay in the mornings, and I would meet her at the station in the evening again. On campus, the professoriate was comprised of a fascinating array of conflicting thinkers. I was studying and discussing hermeneutics with Mark Beaver, and some of the brilliant students who'd been pulled into the circle around the tremendous Heideggerian, very sad he died, Hubert Dreyfus. Berkeley still had living memory of Foucault as well, and the great interpretive sociologist Robert Bellow was still there, still alive, very sad, also died. Judith Butler taught there, and I took 2 seminars with her partner, Wendy Brown. I also entered into dialogue with defenders of neo-Kantianism and of John Rawls and analytic philosophers, most notably John Searle, whose interest in social ontology led to his eventual participation on my dissertation committee. I later discovered that Searle, before he became a persona non grata, enjoyed a spirited back and forth with the Dominican friars from St. Albert's Priory in Oakland, some of whom would later become my friends and help us into the church. At the same time, away from the university, in our luminous Berkeley apartment, Elle and I were having these rolling discussions about what it meant to be married, about what our love was about or what our lives were about. We had many long conversations about the significance of our lives or how we even knew we were living them well. Christ came up more and more in these discussions, not as some kind of moralism or dogma, but as a beautiful person, as a person whose life resonated more and a story that resonated more as to what it meant to live well than any other story you could encounter, any other life you could encounter. It seemed like beauty had become a person, a man. Beauty had become a man. Christ seemed to us the first person in history who taught that the deepest and most fundamental meaning of self is love as self-sacrificial gift. Had we not been living that, even if only dimly, before we even understood? Had Christ not been with us, not in our awareness, not in our cognition or comprehension, but in our unwillingness to give up on each other? Or perhaps that's not even primordial enough. Maybe in some presence we didn't understand. I began rereading Dostoevsky and the Gospels together and insisting that Christianity was the noblest story imaginable and that no human mind could have come up with it. It was so beautiful. That's just knockoff Dostoevsky, by the way. But knockoff Dostoevsky's gold, right? Christ's biography in its 4 versions was absolutely shocking, baffling, unimaginably good. It took twists and turns no one could foresee. And inside the story were his stories, strange stories, parables about widows and mustard seeds, lost coins and lost sheep, wineskins and pearls, prodigal sons, rich men and servants. The back and forth went between us for a long time, perhaps longer than it should have. But at a certain point, I became weary of all the talking. She began going to different churches by herself for several months on Sunday mornings. She would come back afterwards and report what she'd experienced. She was tired of mere arguments. There was not a relationship of love, she said, in that, but abstract philosophical games. She was of the absolute conviction that faith needed to be a relationship with something or even someone outside of oneself. You loved someone with your whole person, not just your mind. One day she suggested we go to St. Mary Magdalene Parish in Berkeley. There were Dominican friars there, and she told me you could argue with them all you want to after Mass. But for an entire hour, you have to be silent and pray and sing. And, the Eucharist holds sway over everyone together. Elle entered the church at St. Mary Magdalene on Easter Vigil of 2010. I followed her because, like so many times since we were teenagers, I wanted to stay close to her and see what she saw. And like so many times before, I discovered that after swallowing my pride, each step brought 100-fold in return. For it is true, as the Son of Man has said, so we might hear the words again for the first time. One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Thank you.